My name is Rachel Martinez and I'm 29 years old. What happened when my parents knocked on the door of 1247 Maple Street last Tuesday morning is something that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. Picture this: my mother and father standing on the front porch of the house where I grew up, the house they'd sold 5 years earlier to fund my brother's startup dreams, nervously shifting from foot to foot as they prepared to beg the current owners for permission to retrieve some forgotten family heirlooms. But when the door opened, the face looking back at them wasn't that of a stranger. It was their daughter, the same daughter they'd displaced to finance their son's ambitions. Now standing as the legal owner of the home they'd sacrificed for someone else's future. You see, that moment when recognition dawned in their eyes wasn't just shock. It was the instant they realized that their less promising daughter had not only survived being displaced from her childhood sanctuary, but had thrived enough to eventually buy it back. The same parents who had told me 5 years earlier that sacrifices have to be made for family success were now face to face with the daughter who had quietly turned that sacrifice into her greatest motivation for building something extraordinary. Before we dive into this story, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories about perseverance, success, and the moment when family choices come full circle in the most unexpected ways. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. I love connecting with people who understand that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming successful enough to reclaim what was taken from you. Let me take you back to that devastating day 5 years ago when everything changed. March 15, 2019, when I came home from my junior year at college to find my parents sitting at the kitchen table with real estate documents spread between them, their faces wearing expressions I'd never seen before. "Rachel, sit down," Dad said, his voice carrying that formal tone he used for serious family discussions. "We need to talk about some changes we're making." I set down my backpack and took the chair across from them, immediately noticing the tension in the room. Mom wasn't making eye contact, and Dad kept rearranging the papers in front of him, both signs that whatever they were about to tell me, they weren't comfortable with it. "We're selling the house," Mom said simply, the words hitting me like a physical blow. "Selling our house? Why?" Dad cleared his throat. "Your brother Kevin has an incredible business opportunity. He's developed a revolutionary app that could change how people manage their finances, and he needs capital to take it to market." Kevin. My younger brother by 3 years, the family's golden child who had dropped out of college after his sophomore year to pursue entrepreneurship. While I was grinding through my accounting degree and working part-time to minimize student loans, Kevin was living at home, working on various revolutionary ideas that our parents funded and supported unconditionally. "How much capital does he need?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "The startup investors want to see $200,000 in family commitment before they'll consider matching funds," Dad explained. "It shows that we believe in Kevin's vision, and the only way to get $200,000 is to sell our house. We've looked at every option," Mom said defensively. "Refinancing, loans, liquidating savings. Nothing else gives us access to that kind of money quickly enough." I stared at them, processing what they were telling me. The house where I had grown up, where every room held memories of birthday parties, homework sessions, family dinners, and quiet moments that had shaped who I was, they were going to sell it to fund Kevin's latest business idea. "Where will you live?" I asked. "We found a nice apartment across town," Dad said. "It's smaller, but it'll work fine for the two of us. And with the money from the house sale, we can not only invest in Kevin's company but also have enough left over to live comfortably while it grows." "What about me?" The silence that followed was answer enough. They'd planned their post-house life around supporting Kevin's dreams, and my place in that new arrangement was clearly an afterthought. "Well, you're finishing college soon," Mom said eventually. "You'll be starting your career, probably moving to a different city for job opportunities. This is good timing for everyone." Good timing for everyone. Translation: good timing for Kevin, and everyone else would have to adjust. "I was planning to move back home after graduation," I said quietly, "to save money while I built up some savings and looked for the right career opportunity." "You're smart and capable," Dad said. "You'll figure it out. This is bigger than personal convenience. This is about Kevin's future and our family's financial security." "Kevin's future? What about my future?" "Your future doesn't require a $200,000 investment to get started," Mom said, as if that somehow made sense. "You have a solid degree and good grades. You can build your career the traditional way." "The traditional way?" Unlike Kevin, who apparently deserved family sacrifice to skip traditional career building and jump straight to entrepreneurial success. "When is this happening?" "We're listing the house next week," Dad said. "The market is strong right now, and Kevin's investors want to see the family commitment by June 1st. 2.5 months. They were giving me 2.5 months to process losing my childhood home so they could bet our family's primary asset on Kevin's app idea. "What if Kevin's startup fails?" I asked. "What if this app doesn't work out like you're hoping?" The question clearly made them uncomfortable, but Dad answered with the kind of forced confidence that suggested he'd been asking himself the same thing. "Kevin has a track record of innovative thinking. His previous projects might not have reached market, but they showed real potential. This time is different. He has a solid business plan, potential investors lined up, and a product that solves a real problem." Previous projects that hadn't reached market. That was a diplomatic way of describing Kevin's history of abandoned apps, half-finished websites, and revolutionary ideas that he dropped whenever they required more work than initial excitement could sustain. But I was 21 years old, financially dependent on parents who had already made their decision, and in no position to argue against sacrificing my stability for Kevin's opportunity. The house sold in 6 weeks for $340,000. After paying off the remaining mortgage and transaction costs, my parents had $285,000 to work with. They gave Kevin his requested $200,000, and used the remaining $85,000 to set themselves up in their new apartment and maintain their lifestyle, while waiting for returns on their investment in his company. I spent that summer living in the cramped apartment with them, sleeping on a fold-out couch in what had once been a spacious living room, watching Kevin excitedly prepare to launch his startup with funding that had cost our family its generational home. When I graduated that December with my accounting degree and a 3.8 GPA, there was no family home to return to for celebration. Instead, we had a modest dinner at a chain restaurant, where Kevin dominated the conversation with updates about his app's development timeline and user testing results. But something had changed in me during those months of displacement and uncertainty. Losing the security of a family home, watching my parents bet everything on Kevin's dreams, while treating my future as less worthy of investment, had crystallized a determination I hadn't known I possessed. I was going to rebuild what they'd torn down, and I was going to do it without anyone's help or sacrifice. If you've ever had your stability sacrificed for someone else's dreams, type "displaced for family" in the comments. What comes next is going to show you exactly how powerful motivation can be when it's born from having everything familiar taken away. The first year after graduation was brutal in ways my parents never understood or acknowledged. While Kevin worked on perfecting his app with their generous funding, I was navigating entry-level employment, student loan payments, and the reality of building a life from scratch without the safety net most college graduates took for granted. I found work at a small accounting firm in the city, making $38,000 a year, enough to rent a studio apartment and cover basic expenses, but nowhere near enough to save significantly or build toward future goals. Every month, I watched $847 go to student loans, $1,200 to rent, and hundreds more to utilities, groceries, and transportation, leaving me with barely enough to maintain an emergency fund, much less pursue opportunities that required investment. Meanwhile, Kevin was burning through the $200,000 at an alarming rate. App development costs, marketing consultants, office space rental, equipment purchases, and what he called networking investments were consuming the house sale proceeds faster than anyone had anticipated. But whenever I visited my parents in their apartment, the conversation centered on Kevin's progress and potential, never on how the financial decisions that had enabled his opportunity were affecting my ability to build stability. "Kevin's beta testing is showing really promising user engagement," Mom would update me proudly. "His investor meetings are going well, and he thinks he'll be ready to launch publicly within 6 months. That's great," I'd respond, while internally calculating that, at his current burn rate, Kevin would exhaust their investment long before generating any revenue. "How's your job going?" Dad would ask, almost as an afterthought. "It's good experience. I'm learning a lot about tax preparation and small business accounting." "That's nice, dear." Kevin was telling us about this conference he's attending in Austin. Such valuable networking opportunities. Kevin's conference attendance funded by house sale proceeds. My career development funded by $38,000 annual salary and weekend work preparing individual tax returns for extra income. But I I was learning more than just accounting during those first 2 years. Working with small business owners taught me about entrepreneurship from the ground up, not the venture capital funded, family investment version that Kevin was pursuing, but the bootstrap your way to success version that required creativity, persistence, and careful financial management. I started noticing patterns in which businesses succeeded and which failed, which expenses were necessary versus wasteful, which revenue models were sustainable versus flashy but impractical. I also started developing relationships with clients who valued my insights and began asking for business consulting beyond just tax preparation. By my second year at the firm, I was handling bookkeeping and financial planning for 12 small businesses, earning additional income that I saved religiously while Kevin continued spending my parents' investment on his app's development. In year 3, Kevin finally launched his financial management app. The launch was accompanied by a family celebration dinner where my parents beamed with pride as he demonstrated the elegant interface and explained the sophisticated algorithms that would revolutionize how people handled their money. The app failed spectacularly within 8 months. Not because the technology was flawed, but because Kevin had focused on creating something impressive rather than something people actually wanted to use. The sophisticated features that had excited him during development turned out to be overwhelming for average users, while the basic functionality they did want was available in simpler, cheaper alternatives. By the time Kevin admitted the failure and officially shut down the company, he had spent $247,000 of the $285,000 my parents had gained from selling our house. The remaining $38,000 was all they had left from sacrificing their home for his entrepreneurial dreams. But while Kevin's well-funded startup was failing, my bootstrap consulting practice was thriving. During his app development years, I had quietly built a client base of 43 small businesses who relied on my accounting services, financial planning, and increasingly strategic business consulting. My annual income had grown from $38,000 to $127,000. And I had saved $89,000 toward goals my parents knew nothing about. More importantly, I had been tracking the real estate market in our old neighborhood, watching property values and waiting for the right opportunity. In October of year 4, exactly 41 months after my parents sold 1247 Maple Street, it came back on the market. The family who had purchased it from my parents was relocating for work and needed to sell quickly. They were asking $425,000. Significantly more than my parents had received, but still within reach of what I had been preparing for. I made an offer of $398,000, which was accepted after a brief negotiation. Using my savings as a down payment, and qualifying for a mortgage based on my consulting income, I closed on the purchase of my childhood home on December 18th, exactly 5 years after graduating college with nowhere to live. I didn't tell my parents about the purchase. They knew I had been doing well with my accounting practice, but they had no idea how well, and they certainly didn't know I had been planning to reclaim what they had sold. For the next 8 months, I quietly moved back into the house where I'd grown up, spending weekends and evenings restoring it to the warm, welcoming space I remembered from childhood. I repainted the rooms in colors that had been changed by the previous owners, restored the garden my mother had loved, and slowly turned 1247 Maple Street back into the family home it had been before being sacrificed for Kevin's dreams. Kevin, meanwhile, was struggling. The failure of his startup had shattered his confidence, and he was working a series of temporary jobs while trying to figure out his next move. My parents were dealing with their own challenges, Dad's health issues were mounting, and their savings had been severely depleted by the failed investment in Kevin's company. But I was thriving in ways that would have been impossible without the motivation that came from losing everything familiar and having to rebuild from nothing. Then came the phone call that set up our inevitable confrontation. "Rachel," Mom's voice was hesitant when she called on a Tuesday morning in September. "We need to ask you a favor, and I know it's going to sound strange." "What kind of favor?" "Your grandmother's jewelry box and your father's coin collection are still somewhere in the house we used to own. We forgot to take them when we moved, and we've been thinking about them more and more lately." The house we used to own. Not our old house or your childhood home. The house we used to own, as if it were just another piece of real estate rather than the foundation of our family life. "We were wondering if you might contact the current owners and ask if we could retrieve those items. We know it's awkward, but they have significant sentimental value. You want me to contact strangers and ask if you can search through their house for things you forgot when you sold it 5 years ago?" We thought maybe if you explained the situation they might be understanding. People are usually sympathetic about family heirlooms. I sat there holding the phone, looking around the kitchen where this conversation was taking place, the same kitchen where they'd told me 5 years earlier that sacrifices had to be made for family success. Actually, I said slowly, I think I can help you with that. Why? Meet me at 1247 Maple Street at 11 o'clock. I'll make sure you get what you're looking for. 2 hours later, I watched through the front window as my parents parked on the street and walked slowly up the front path, both of them looking nervous about approaching strangers to request access to their former home. Dad knocked on the door, the same door he'd closed behind him for the final time 5 years earlier, the same door that had once been his entrance to security and stability before he'd traded it all for Kevin's startup capital. When I opened that door and saw their faces, the shock was so complete and overwhelming that Mom actually took a step backward. "Rachel," she whispered, as if seeing me there didn't make sense according to any reality she understood. "Hi, Mom. Dad, come in." They stood on the porch, frozen, as their brains tried to process what they were seeing. Their daughter. In their former home. Opening the door as if she belonged there. What are you doing here?" Dad asked, his voice barely steady. "I live here. This is my house now." The silence that followed was deafening. They stared at me, then at the familiar entryway behind me, then back at me. "Your house?" Mom repeated. "I bought it 8 months ago. Same house you sold to fund Kevin's startup. Same house I grew up in. Same house you displaced me from so you could invest in his app that failed." The words hung between us like a challenge. After 5 years of displacement, struggle, and rebuilding, I was back where I belonged, but they were the ones who were homeless in the space that had once defined our family. "You bought our house," Dad said numbly. "I bought my house. The house that became available after you sold it, and Kevin's company failed, and the people you sold it to decided to move. But how could you afford? How did you manage? The same way you taught me to manage everything else after you sold our home." "I figured it out myself." They stood there on the threshold of the house they'd sacrificed for someone else's dreams, realizing that the daughter they'd displaced had not only survived, but had thrived enough to reclaim what they'd lost. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "Let's find those family heirlooms you forgot when you decided Kevin's future was more important than our family stability." The tour of their former home was unlike anything I could have imagined. Walking through rooms where they'd raised me, watching them recognize furniture I'd kept, and changes I'd made, seeing them process the reality that their less promising daughter had succeeded enough to buy back what they'd sold. It was vindication and heartbreak simultaneously. In my father's former study, now my home office, they found his coin collection exactly where he'd left it, forgotten in the rush to liquidate assets for Kevin's investment. In the master bedroom, they discovered my grandmother's jewelry box tucked away in a closet, overlooked during their hasty move to apartment living. "Rachel," Mom said as we sat in the kitchen where they'd once explained why sacrifices had to be made for family success, "we need to understand how this happened." "Which part?" "How I survived being displaced from my home to fund someone else's dreams. How I built a business from nothing while Kevin spent your investment on his failed startup. Or how I saved enough money to buy back what you sold, all of it." So I told them about the years of working 2 jobs while Kevin pursued his funded dreams, about building a consulting practice from entry-level accounting work, about saving every possible dollar while they celebrated his expensive progress, about watching real estate prices and waiting for the opportunity to reclaim what they'd taken from me. "You've been planning this," Dad said. "For years you've been planning to buy back this house. I've been working toward having the stability you took away when you decided my future was less important than Kevin's opportunity." "That's not what we decided. That's exactly what we decided." You decided. You looked at 2 children and chose to sacrifice one's security for the other's potential. You sold the home where I planned to live after college so Kevin could have startup capital. You displaced me so he could have opportunity. The truth of it was undeniable. Sitting there in the kitchen where they'd made that decision 5 years earlier, "We thought Kevin's success would benefit the whole family," Mom said weakly. "Kevin's success was supposed to benefit Kevin. My displacement was just collateral damage you were willing to accept. And now? Now I have what I worked for. Kevin is struggling to rebuild after his failure. And you're living in an apartment with $38,000 left from the $285,000 you got from selling our family home. The visit ended with them taking the heirlooms they'd come for, but leaving behind any illusions about the consequences of their choices 5 years earlier. 3 months later, Kevin called me. Rachel, I need to apologize to you. For what? For not understanding what our parents' investment in my startup cost you. For not realizing that funding my dreams meant displacing yours. Thank you for saying that. I failed, Rachel. The company failed, the app failed, and I wasted money that came from selling your home. I destroyed our family's stability for nothing. You didn't destroy anything, Kevin. You pursued an opportunity that was funded by a choice our parents made. The failure isn't your responsibility. But the cost to you is. The cost to me became my motivation. Losing the security of home taught me to build my own security. Still, I'm sorry. And I'm proud of this. What you've accomplished. That conversation began a process of rebuilding our relationship, based on honesty rather than family dynamics that had positioned us as competing for limited resources and support. But the most significant change was in my relationship with my parents. 6 months after their visit to reclaim forgotten heirlooms, they asked if they could visit again, not to retrieve anything, but to see how I'd restored the home they'd sold. It looks just like I remember it, Mom said, tears in her eyes as she walked through rooms I'd painted back to their original colors. Like the home we had before everything changed, this is the home we had before you sold it, I corrected gently. I've just been restoring what was lost. Rachel, can you forgive us for what we put you through? I already have. But I need you to understand that what you did had consequences that went far beyond funding Kevin's startup. You taught me that security is something I can only provide for myself. We made the wrong choice. You made a choice that prioritized one child's potential over another child's stability. Whether it was wrong depends on whether you learned from the results. 1 year later, when Kevin had rebuilt his confidence and found work that utilized his skills without requiring family investment, we had Thanksgiving dinner together in the dining room where we'd once celebrated as a traditional family. But now we were something different, a family that had learned about consequences, choices, and what it means to rebuild after everything familiar has been sacrificed for someone else's dreams. The parents who had sold my childhood home for my brother's startup were now guests in the house their daughter had worked to reclaim. The daughter they had displaced had become the family member with the most stable foundation. And the son whose dreams had required everyone else's sacrifice had learned that true success can't be built on the destruction of other people's security. Sometimes the most powerful response to having your stability sacrificed isn't anger or resentment. It's quietly building something so substantial that you can eventually reclaim what was taken from you. And sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply being successful enough to open the door when the people who displaced you come back looking for what they forgot when they chose to prioritize someone else's future over your present. The house at 1247 Maple Street is mine now, bought with money I earned after being displaced from it, restored to the warm sanctuary it was before being sold to fund dreams that never materialized. When my parents knocked on that door looking for forgotten heirlooms, they found something they hadn't expected, the daughter they'd underestimated, thriving in the space they'd sacrificed for someone else's ambition. What stability have you rebuilt after having it sacrificed for someone else's dreams? What home have you reclaimed? Through your own success? Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever been displaced for family choices that didn't include your needs, you're not alone. Comment rebuilt from sacrifice if you understand the power of transforming displacement into motivation. Share this story with someone who needs to know that losing everything familiar can become the foundation for building something even stronger. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories about family choices, personal resilience, and the moment when sacrifice becomes success. I'd love to know, should families sacrifice one member's stability for another's opportunity, or should support be distributed more equally? Let me know in the comments. Remember, your security doesn't require anyone else's approval, and the stability you build yourself can never be sold by someone else for someone else's dreams.